Good afternoon, everybody. I think we've got about everybody here. And welcome to the penultimate presentation of the 15th Annual International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. First of all, I'd like to thank Mehrdad Nardi Kia for bringing this remarkable event to UM every year, now for a decade and a half. If you haven't organized one of these things, it takes an incredible amount of effort and energy, and they do it year after year. Today, it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Robert Green, Associate Professor of History at the University of Montana. Some of you have heard me introduce Rob before, and so I won't repeat one of my past performances, but those of you who have heard me introduce him before know that I hold him in very, very high regard. He's an accomplished historian, a colleague, and, as you're about to find out, a terrific speaker. After graduating summa cum laude in history and Russian studies from the University of Rochester, Rob did his PhD at the University of Michigan. He taught for 2 years at Michigan before we were lucky enough to hire him. I want to spend a minute or two introducing Rob's work so you get a sense of the kind of history that Rob does. His work deals primarily with the social and cultural history of Orthodox religion in Russia and the Soviet Union. He co-edited a collection of essays entitled Orthodox Russia, Belief and Practice Under the Tsars, and in 2010, he published Bodies Like Bright Stars, Saints and Relics in Orthodox Russia. That book examines the relationship between Orthodox believers and their saints in late Tsarist and early Soviet Russia. He pays particular attention to the role of relics. The Orthodox faithful prayed to their saints for help with everyday needs and concerns, and they did so through the agency of shrines and relics. One time I heard Rob explain this process as kind of a spiritual ATM that would go to get stuff out. And I guess to their mind it worked. The book is a model of scholarship. It's carefully researched. It offers a bold and original analysis, and it is engagingly written. Unlike so much modern academic writing, it's not encumbered by jargon. It is clear and clean and enlivened by Rob's keen wit. Rob also, with Eugene of Rutin, translated and co-edited the memoirs of Anna Pavlova Vygotsky, as they describe her, quote, an ordinary Jewish woman in the Russian Empire. She escaped from the Pale of Settlement and went to St. Petersburg. She became a Montessori teacher, and in the years after the Russian Revolution was an advocate for early childhood education. She was 75 years old when the Nazis murdered her in 1943. All of Rob's work has been marked by clarity, the analytical force of his presentation, his truly impressive learning, and his wry sense of humor. So I'm looking forward to his talk with great anticipation. Today he's going to talk about the Russian perspective on U.S.-Russian relations, and so give a warm welcome to Professor Robert Green.
Good afternoon, and I want to thank my friend and colleague Mike Mayer for that very warm and hopefully legitimate introduction. I hope what follows will live up to that. I'd like to echo Mike in thanking Professors Ardi and Mehrdad Kia for their work in organizing this conference year after year, and thanks to all of you for sitting in the dark on what is an otherwise glorious day here in western Montana. So, as Mike said, my own work kind of engages with cultural and social history in the 19th and 20th century. So, who better to talk about foreign policy in the contemporary period than I? So, thinking about this question historically is kind of what I want to do this morning, and think about Russian foreign policy, in particular Russian foreign policy with regards to the European question today. So, thinking about it from an historical perspective, historians as you know, are fond of dates. If you've ever taken a history course, you're likely obliged to have memorized some of these dates. And we're fond of using dates as a means of organizing the past into discrete, comprehensible blocks of time. And this process of periodization obliges the historian to identify turning points, to identify moments of breakage and collapse, when a new way of thinking or acting replaces or subsumes an older order. And it's an imperfect process, to be sure. There's inevitable overlap, some indisputable fuzziness along the edges. There's room for debate and contestation. When precisely, for example, did the early modern era give way to the modern age? But for all of its problems, periodization serves a useful purpose insofar as it allows us to impose order on and make sense of the complexities of past human experience. So, in my own field, the course of Russian history is generally broken down into chronological periods corresponding with the dominant model of political organization that prevailed at the time. So we start with the era of Kievan Rus, the first Russian princely state, followed by the era of the Mongol yoke, Y-O-K-E, not Y-O-L-K, as some students want to spell it, but the Mongol yoke when the Russian lands were scattered and subdued by Tatar hordes from the east, followed by the Muscovite era, when the princes of Moscow asserted their independence against their Mongol overlords and gradually gathered in, conquered the Russian lands and brought them under their personal autocratic rule. From there, we march forward to the imperial period, beginning with Tsar Peter the Great at the turn of the 18th century, when Russia first stepped onto the international stage and laid claim to membership amongst the great powers of Europe, largely on the basis of its military prowess. And of course, the Soviet period, when Lenin and the Bolshevik Party came to power amidst the collapse of the First World War, the fall of the Tsarist system, and established the world's first socialist state, and with it a one-party regime that would last for more than 70 years. So I'm going somewhere with this. That is that since the official demise of the Soviet Union, Christmas Day, 1991, historians have been at a certain loss as to what to call this present period. What do we call Russia now? Post-Soviet Russia seems less and less fitting a label, a quarter century now after the collapse of the Soviet system, as the USSR recedes further and further into the historical past. So to speak of Russia today as post-Soviet conjures up, inevitably, these sort of unavoidable Cold War connotations of missile crises, détente, high-level summits, and so forth. So more and more, I think, historians, if not necessarily policy analysts and media pundits, are moving beyond the conceptual category of post-Soviet Russia and increasingly embracing the idea that we're now living through a period of the Russian present that we today and future generations of Russian historians to come might well call the age of Putin. That after 8 years of Putin's first presidency, a 4-year obligatory interregnum with Putin cooling his heels as prime minister, and now since 2012 with term limits constitutionally abolished, the return of Putin to the presidential office with no end in sight, we may now safely speak of Putinism as a coherent, if not always cohesive, ideology, one that has shaped and informed Russian domestic and foreign policy for the past 17 years and will likely do so well into the foreseeable future, long after Vladimir Vladimirovich has wrestled to the ground his last tiger. So what are the stakes of such a claim? More brusquely put, on a Friday afternoon, why does this matter? The point I want to stress is that how we periodize the past isn't simply a scholastic question of academic nomenclature. The label we affix to a given era invariably comes to shape and determine how we see that era. In this case, how we process and make sense of the Russian present in the context of the immediate past. And so to speak of the era of Putin, as I think now we can do, allows us to move beyond lingering binary Cold War models and try to make sense of the Russian present and Russian policy on its own terms. So Putin, as you know, is a figure of endless fascination. in the Russian and Western imagination. And over the past few years, Western readers have been treated to literally dozens of books, hundreds of articles about Putin, some of them very good, many of them very bad. One of the very best of the recent studies is a slim book entitled Putinism, written by Walter LaCour, a longtime Russia watcher, Russia expert, former chair of the International Research Council of the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C., a former visiting professor at Penn, Harvard, dozens of schools. In this book, LaCour argues that there is an ideological consistency to the style that Putin has crafted, the policies he has carried out over the past decade and a half. And much as Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski sought to tabulate a checklist of the component elements of totalitarianism more than 50 years ago, LaCour, too, has begun to sketch out a short list of the principal political elements that combine to form Putinism. So Putinism consists of a heady mix of equal parts national chauvinism and sociocultural conservatism with a strong sprinkling of Orthodox Christianity. And amidst the cloud of incense smoke, the relentless peal of church bells, there is also inherent in Putinism this profound nostalgia for lost national prestige and a deep suspicion of the political motivations of the Western powers, Europe and the U.S. This sounds familiar. Yet, while many analysts go back no further than Joseph Stalin in search of an historical analog, LaCour argues, convincingly I think, that to understand Putinism, we need to think about deep seams and currents in Russian culture and society that go back far beyond the Cold War, far back beyond even 1917. Like the illiberal autocrats of the Romanov dynasty, Putin is a great advocate of state power. In Russian, the idea of государственность, and this is a key element of Putinism. We might translate государственность as stateness or statism, and in practice, государственность is based on the political assumption that the state ought to play the leading role in national life, that the state can and ought to and has a moral, ethical obligation to regulate and rein in, when necessary, elements of society in the interests of preserving stability, maintaining social order. To that end, like the Russian czars before him, Putin believes in using the organs and arms of the state to police the borders of public life and civil society, metaphorically and literally, to use the power of the state-controlled media to shape the national conversation, to monitor and, as necessary, censor and surveil individual expression and political action in the interests of national security and for the good of an imagined collective, i.e. the nation. Государственность also means, in practice, using the state's monopoly on violence, on police power, but also judicial power, carceral power, as a means to safeguard against the perceived perils of social pluralism, which the Putin regime equates with chaos. And in Russian, chaos or chaos is a loaded term in the vernacular, one that evokes for many millions of Russians unpleasant memories of the upheavals of the wild 90s and the economic instability, political uncertainty, and lost prestige that is popularly associated with the Yeltsin years. Now, to Western ears, culturally attuned as ours are to prick up at any hint of state intrusion into the private sphere, государственность sounds profoundly illiberal and inherently undemocratic. And it is. But as LaCour points out, most Russians have come to believe that democracy is what happened in and to their country between 1990 and 2000, and they do not want any more of it. So if Putinism places inordinate value on strong state institutions, it does so as a safeguard against the messiness that attends that messiest of all political systems, liberal democracy. and preserving all the trappings and fixtures of constitutional rule, even while stripping those institutions of any real content, Putin's Russia might best be conceived of, in Walter Lippmann's famous phrasing, as a guided or managed democracy. So concurrent with this notion of государственность is the idea of Zapadophobia, or fear of the West. And this phobia or fear makes itself manifest, takes form among Russian policymakers, nationalists, and intellectuals as a kind of general anti-Western sentiment. And it begins by assuming an oppositional, indeed irreconcilable rift between Russia and her neighbors, the interests of Russia and the interests of Russia's neighbors. This binary worldview takes as its axiomatic starting point the position that Russia's neighbors have long sought and are forever seeking to make advances against, encroach upon Russia's self-styled, historically determined sphere of influence. Through the prism of Zapadophobia, Western fear of the West, the Kremlin interprets, for example, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, as you see here, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, not as spontaneous popular uprisings that overthrew illiberal regimes in former Soviet republics, but as efforts orchestrated by the Western powers to extend unlawfully their influence into what Russians refer to somewhat possessively, somewhat nostalgically, as the near abroad. In other words, those countries just beyond Russia's present-day borders, but which are popularly believed to fall within her historical sphere of influence. So in this line of thinking, the Arab Spring, like the color revolutions of the decade prior, are really an attempt by the U.S. and its military allies to press forward their own proprietary interests at the expense of regimes friendly to, or in the case of Syria, directly allied with, Russia. Now, I mentioned this notion of the fear of the West, of Zapadophobia, because I think it helps provide some deeper context for one of Putin's most quoted public remarks, or at least one that has been very widely quoted in the West. In his 2005 State of the Nation address before the Duma, Putin famously described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. A debatable designation, to be sure. Setting aside the fact that the 20th century witnessed a veritable surfeit of catastrophes, any number of which might well lay claim to the title of greatest, as in worst, what did Putin mean by this? And just as importantly, what did he not mean? When Western commentators quote that 2005 speech, they seize, understandably, on that greatest catastrophe line, but seldom go any further. In the very next sentence, Putin describes what the great tragedy of the USSR's demise was. He says, that tragedy consisted of the fact that tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. There's a lot of meaning in those lines. And to be clear, in mourning the collapse of the USSR, Putin does not lament the demise of Marxism-Leninism as a political and economic ideology. He sheds no tears for the Bolsheviks' long-deferred dream of a radiant communist utopia. What Putin mourns in mourning the loss of the USSR is the loss of territory broadly conceived, not territory for territory's sake, but for the sake of what that loss means in terms of present-day prestige. So what Putin laments is the steep and rapid decline over the past quarter century of Russia's international reputation and prestige as a global superpower. And arresting this decline, reversing that trend, restoring Russia to a place of real, or at least perceived, greatness is perhaps the major motivating factor behind Putin's foreign policy today. So this idea of national regeneration, the restoration of national glory and greatness, is the kind of connecting thread that runs through much, if not all, of Putin's foreign and domestic policy. And in the West, I think that restorative, regenerative mission is often interpreted quite literally, that Putin wants to get the band back together, rebuild the Soviet Union, restore the old Russian Empire. I don't think that Putinism conceives of its regenerative mission necessarily in such concrete terms or in so literal a sense. This gentlewoman aside, polls suggest that popular nostalgia for the Soviet period is dwindling among the Russian population as a whole. And the word Putin often uses to refer to the collapse of the USSR is raspad, or disintegration. That's a telling word, I think. A decline can be arrested, even reversed. What is lost can be regained. But that which has disintegrated, as has the USSR, can less easily be put back together again. So Putinism seeks, I think, to pursue this cause of national regeneration in ways that go beyond the merely territorial, and to do so by more covert means. Putin's commitment to the cause of nationalism in an increasingly globalist age makes him, in some ways, the banner or rallying point for similar nationalist political movements and ideologies ascendant across Europe today. Consider, for example, the forward surge of the radical right in France, in Hungary, in the Netherlands, the Britain First arguments put forward by proponents of Brexit, the merciless whitewashing of national history undertaken by state actors in Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, selective memory, deliberate forgetting. With it, the rising tide of anti-Semitism across the continent. It's no accident, I think, that the nationalist right across Europe sees Putin as an ideological ally, an ally against the seemingly inexorable cultural, economic, and demographic shifts taking place around them. The Austrian Freedom Party, the UK Independence Party, the Five Star Movement in Italy, Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom, the PVV in the Netherlands, have all expressed a desire that if they're in power, they will deepen their respective countries' ties with Russia and extricate their nations from their commitments to the European Union. Putin is himself, and I don't think this is a purely cynical ploy, a religious man. He genuinely imagines himself to be a good, pious, Orthodox Christian. And he plays this spiritual role to the hilt in his public political performances. For Putin, being an Orthodox Christian is inextricably linked to being Russian. These are mutually reinforcing identities. And Putin has taken great pains in power to associate his political authority as president with the moral sanction of the Orthodox Church. Following his second inauguration in 2012, Putin attended a church service in the Moscow Kremlin. The chief celebrant was the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, who brought out for the occasion the 12th century icon of the Vladimir Mother of God, one of the most sacred objects in all Russian culture. The same icon, incidentally, that was brought out to bless the czars at their coronations in centuries past. These highly choreographed rituals, where nothing is left to chance, serve obviously for Putin as a means of self-fashioning, to legitimate and make sacred Putin's personal charisma and political power. But such spiritual theater serves also, I think, to portray Putinism as an alternative to competing models of political sovereignty on offer across the modern world. In contrast to an increasingly avowedly multicultural West that continues to embrace a slippery slate of secular values divorced from moral absolutes, Putinism deliberately blurs the lines between church and state and presents itself as a system whose authority is based on unshakable pillars of tradition and solidity. So, if we think of Putinism as, in part at least, a myth of national regeneration, Putinism's dominant myth is accompanied, as myths of national regeneration so often are, by a deep suspicion of political, cultural, and/or social contamination coming from a corrupting outside force, an unassimilable other, in this case, the West. And LeCour and other political scientists and historians argue that the roots of this Zapadophobia, this fear of the West, stretch back at least to the 19th century. And the West figures in Putin's imagination, as it did for Russian nationalists in the Tsarist period, as a kind of elusive and alluring other. The West is this sort of ever-shifting set of values and ideals whose one constant is that it stands in opposition to the qualities and morals that Russia holds dear, that what makes the Russian soul unique. right? That Russia offers, in place of the competitiveness, individualism, and tempo of the West, Russia offers tradition, collective obligation, responsibility, spirituality, and soulfulness. So while there are undoubtedly intellectual roots, and you can trace this kind of Slavophilic sentiment all the way back through the 19th century, there are intellectual roots, there are historical roots to this Zapadophobia that we see with Putin and Putinism, but a large part of it, too, is responsive. It's a response to the simple but unpleasant truth that many in the Kremlin, Putin himself included, perceive the Western powers as untrustworthy partners. The United States government, for example, which has broken virtually every international promise and pledge made to Russia since 1990, and after a quarter century of this, the West, as an object of emulation or adoration, has lost a great deal of luster in the eyes of Russian political leaders. So to understand Putin's foreign policy, to think about how that foreign policy plays out in Europe today, I think it's instructive to think about how Moscow perceives its relationship with the Western powers and what the Kremlin sees as Russia's rightful place and proper role in Europe. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but I think a proper analog, if we're looking for one, that takes us back into the Russian historical past is between Putin and Tsar Nicholas I, a pious, saber-rattling nationalist. Nicholas I, also Putin. Like Tsar Nicholas I, Putin labors under the perception that Western allies are encroaching upon Russia's rightful sphere of influence. For Putin, today, the chief culprit, of course, is NATO. In 1990, during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, then Secretary of State James Baker assured Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO forces would not move, quote, 1 inch to the east, provided that the Soviets agreed to allow a unified Germany to join NATO. This promise was soon forgotten. When Bill Clinton ran for re-election in 1996, he spoke of a NATO on the move, one that would, quote, reach out to all the new democracies in Central Europe, the Baltics, and the new independent states of the former Soviet Union. Clinton couched his pledge in the language of protection. NATO, quote, will promote greater stability in Europe. And Clinton hastened to assure the Russian President Boris Yeltsin that Russia had nothing whatsoever to fear from NATO's eastward expansion. Yeltsin wasn't too concerned about NATO. He had other issues, problems. But Putin and the men who were to become part of his close circle of advisors, who would become the theorists and faces of Putinism in the present day, they did care. In the 1990s, Putin and his future political allies were young men. Putin was himself stationed as KGB chief in Dresden. His future defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, was at the time a KGB operative in Europe as well. And Putin, Ivanov, and company watched as NATO forces did not create greater stability, but from their perspective served as a force of destabilization. NATO forces intervened in the Bosnian Civil War, engaged with Serbian forces allied with Russia. They watched as NATO continued to creep eastward, inch by inch, again in contravention of Baker's now infamous pledge. And as you can see from this map, NATO has expanded dramatically since 1990. Currently includes not only past member countries of the Warsaw Pact, Soviet allies and former client states like the former Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, but has expanded to include even former Soviet republics, constituent members of the USSR, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So from the perspective of the Kremlin and Putin's inner circle, NATO hasn't moved an inch eastward, it's moved hundreds of miles eastward to the very borders of the Russian Federation. Many in the Kremlin today fear that Ukraine will be the next domino to fall to NATO. The Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, declared last year that he intended to put the question of NATO membership to a referendum. And polls at the time indicated that it would likely be approved by Ukrainian voters. The former Soviet Republic of Georgia, too, has been eagerly pursuing NATO membership for some years, and that was an underlying factor in the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. I think we're some years away from either country officially joining NATO as a full-fledged member state, but these conversations and negotiations have been in progress for some time. And it's not a fact that has slipped past Putin's radar. So the advance of NATO, and this map makes it quite visible. On the top you see in blue the NATO members, in red the Warsaw Pact members, in the last year of the Warsaw Pact's existence, 1990-91. And then on the bottom, the tide has shifted. The NATO powers have expanded dramatically to the east, the Warsaw Pact long gone. So the advance of NATO appears to belie all of the West's repeated assurances that the motives of NATO members are purely defensive, that they're aimed at promoting and preserving regional stability. Whatever the motivations of NATO expansion are, and they are legion, both in terms of geopolitics and also in terms of the economics of NATO expansion, but it plays completely into the hands of nationalists like Putin, who have simply to point to a map like this to show Russian voters that the West is pushing up upon our very borders, threatening our sphere of influence. Last winter, then Speaker of the State Duma, Sergei Naryshkin, now Director of Foreign Intelligence in Russia, described NATO as, quote, a cancerous tumor on the European continent, one that should be dissolved for the greater good and stability of Europe. So from the Russian perspective, the march of NATO cannot help but be seen in familiar terms of encroachment, encirclement, and isolation, fears that go well past the Soviet period back into the Russian imperial past. For domestic consumption, and to a certain degree for international audiences, although less successfully, Putinism has been able to package its recent forays into Crimea and the eastern oblasts of Ukraine as a response, as a defensive move against the eastern creep of NATO. In this photograph, you see pro-Russian demonstrators in eastern Ukraine, the disputed territories on the border of Russia and Ukraine, rallying beneath a banner that declares their support for sovereignty, for political independence, in other words, unification with Russia. Why? Because I love Russia. And the quote, not a particularly eloquent one or original one, is attributed in the small print below to Putin, whose steely gaze looks out at us from these posters. Polling data from 2014 showed that 90% of Russian citizens surveyed supported the annexation of Crimea. Less visible, though perhaps even more insidious than Russia's foray into Ukraine, is the Kremlin's continued pattern of covert actions against Western powers, a pattern of covert activity that's taken multiple form in recent years. From the bankrolling of political movements sympathetic to Putin's own sociocultural vision, to hacking attacks against foreign governments and political groups, and of course, shocking but still unclear allegations of interference in last year's U.S. presidential elections. A recent expose in the pages of The New Yorker by Evan Osnos, David Remnick, and Joshua Yaffa reveals, I think conclusively, that Russia has for years been seeking to counter this real or perceived threat of Western encroachment by launching a series of cyber attacks on Western targets. This dates back as far as 2007. The government of Estonia, the former Soviet republic, now an independent state, announced plans to remove a statue of a victorious Russian Soviet soldier that had stood in the center square of the capital city, Tallinn, since the late 1940s. The statue had been installed by Soviet power, and in the late 80s, and especially since independence, that statue had come to be seen by Estonians not as a symbol of their liberation by Soviet troops from fascist occupation, but rather as a hated symbol of Soviet Russian domination. The Russian government, when it heard of the Estonian government's plans to move the statue, condemned the move and warned ominously that moving the statue would be disastrous for Estonians. After the Estonian government carried out the removal, hackers, almost certainly acting with the direct or tacit approval of Russian intelligence, launched a distributed denial of service attack that brought the Estonian internet crashing down for 3 weeks. In the months since November 2016, it seems increasingly difficult to write off such cyber assaults as mere mischief or just dirty tricks as usual. The Russian state's cyber attack against Estonia, undertaken, again, for explicitly political purposes, is an early harbinger of what contemporary military analysts describe as the tactic of hybrid war or nonlinear war, in which military and non-military actors alike are mobilized against a wide array of enemy targets. Such 21st century engagements seek to deliberately blur the line between traditional military objectives, understood as physical points on a map, and new ones aimed at destabilizing the political and cultural landscape of the adversary for overtly political ends. According to Russian military strategist General Valery Gerasimov, an early theorist of the doctrine of hybrid war, the role of non-military means in achieving political and strategic goals has grown in the 21st century. And in many cases, these non-military means have come to exceed the power of weapons in their effectiveness. Now, we might expect these kinds of machinations in the Caucasus, the Baltic region, even in Ukraine, the so-called near abroad. But increasingly, these gambits are extending well beyond former SSRs like Estonia, past the old Iron Curtain, and into Western Europe. We see some unmistakable signs of this, I think, in the mutual admiration between the Russian government and the new far-right parties in Western and Central Europe. There's certainly an ideological convergence here, but the parties in Western and Central Europe, these new far-right parties, are also drawing real and material support from Moscow. It's been shown that in addition to floating low-interest sweetheart loans to Marine Le Pen's National Front Party in France, the Kremlin has bankrolled efforts in traditional media and online to discredit her rival, Emmanuel Macron, as a double threat, as a Wall Street stooge in the pay of global capital, and as a homosexual to boot. Le Pen, who is the recipient of Moscow's largesse, has of course publicly declared her sympathy for Russian policy in Ukraine and her position that Crimea has always been an indivisible part of Russia. Although no smoking gun has been found and any paper trail that once existed has likely long since been shredded, all signs indicate that the Putin regime has been busily helping to promote the far-right extremist party in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, by providing material and monetary aid in the form of campaign broadsheets, party newspapers, even election signs in the recent regional elections. It's always troubling, I think, when a German political party has its own youth league. The AfD's youth league has declared itself in alliance with Putin's United Russia movement. And although the AfD is perhaps most associated today with its leader's very vocal stance against refugee resettlement and a general tone of anti-immigration sentiment, the AfD leaders like Markus Pretzel, Frauke Petry support a whole slate of political, military, and economic policies that overlap with, are consonant with, Putin's own ideal vision of a new Europe. The AfD, for example, has declared its intent to put to a referendum the matter of Germany's withdrawal from the EU and from NATO, to end sanctions on Russia, and to take what is euphemistically described as a balanced position toward the Putin regime. Preliminary polling data suggests the AfD might win as much as 15% of the vote in the September 2017 parliamentary elections later this year. Not enough to form a government, but enough of a presence in the parliament that it may well oblige other parties to include the AfD in a coalition government. In supporting these pro-Russian far-right parties, and these are just two examples, in doing this, the Kremlin is creating what Antonis Klapsis, a Greek scholar from the Martin Center for European Studies, calls Trojan horses, engineered to undermine, in his words, the internal cohesion of the EU and NATO. The head of German foreign intelligence, Bruno Kohl, has publicly stated that the Russian government is deploying a whole host of complementary measures that are aimed less at promoting one single party over any other than at disrupting and destabilizing the political process itself. Putin's goal, according to Kohl, is delegitimizing the democratic process as such, regardless of whom that ends up helping. Call's comments suggest that the Kremlin may be playing a larger or longer game here, one that goes beyond, again, simply endorsing or even bankrolling a particular favored party in any given election cycle, but by manufacturing and disseminating disinformation, disinformatia, by sponsoring or condoning cyber attacks on Western targets, and bankrolling, funding sympathetic political movements like the AfD, the Putin regime is fighting, acknowledged or not, a sort of Gerasimov-style hybrid war that is aimed at discrediting what remains of the normal functioning of the democratic political process across the European continent. So, in conclusion, after nearly 2 decades of defensiveness, Russian policy in Europe and toward Europe has, it seems, I think, shifted undeniably to the offensive. In the age of Putin, Russia's foreign policy toward its European neighbors seems aimed at weakening political consensus in the West by undermining the very institutions that support the liberal international order, which Putin's Russia perceives as a political, economic, and indeed existential threat. Thank you.
You know, W.C. Fields said you should never follow a child act or a dog act, and not to draw too close an analogy, but that's the position I find myself in. In any case, thanks, Rob, for an informative and I think very cogent presentation, which okay, I guess we're not going to get that any higher. Which I think provides us with a pretty good context for comprehending Russia's approach toward the world. And I think I'm particularly drawn to his point that it's now kind of useless to talk about a post-Soviet era, which we all do, and that the period seems best understood, the post-Soviet period, is extending from the fall of the Soviet Union to the rise of Putin, and that we have long since and are now entered and are now in the age of Putin, or the age of Putinism. 3 consecutive American presidents have had to deal with this, and each has begun his administration with the idea that he could get along with Putin. There's an interesting idea. George W. Bush, in his famous first meeting with Putin in 2001 in Slovenia, was a good example. Bush brought up a cross that he had heard Putin's mother had given him. And Putin elaborated on that story. And it clearly moved Bush. Bush later said, "I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul." I think if he had looked more carefully into Putin's eye, he would have seen 3 letters, KGB. A month later, though, Putin showed Bush that cross in question. And Bush wrote, "I had convinced him that I no longer viewed Russia as an enemy, and I viewed him on a personal level as somebody with whom we could deal." By the end of the Bush years, things had cooled appreciably, and the brief war with Georgia had a lot to do with that. As a candidate in 2008, Barack Obama argued that Bush had been too confrontational with the Russians and called for a reset. That began on the wrong foot in March 2009 when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, with a gift, a red button that said reset in English and Peregrushka, is that right? Pretty close, in Russian. Lavrov pointed out that the word meant overcharged. They had somehow screwed that up. And I think that's symbolic of the difficulty, the muddle-headed approach sometimes that American administrations in recent years have had in dealing with Putin. In 2009, in the summer, the Europeans were concerned about the Russian invasion of Georgia the summer before. They were concerned about the new administration's position, and an open letter to Obama from 9 former leaders of the European Union stated that there was, quote, nervousness in our capitals. NATO is weaker today than when we joined. and, quote, Russia is back as a revisionist power pursuing a 19th century agenda. And I think that ties very closely with what Rob was talking about, the Russian agenda and the way the West has perceived it. In July of 2009, Obama made a trip to Russia, gave a speech to the graduates of Moscow's new economic school, and urged the students there to stop viewing the United States as an adversary. He said, the assumption that Russia and the United States are eternal antagonists is a 20th century view rooted in the past. In 2009, he said, a great power does not show strength by dominating or demonizing other countries. The days when empires could treat sovereign states as pieces on a chessboard are over. An interesting theory that seems not to have borne itself out in practice. In September of 2009, in an attempt to reach some sort of accord with Russia, Obama halted the deployment of U.S. missile defense in Eastern Europe that was actually, was interfering in relations with Russia, was actually designed as a defense against Iran. He got nothing for that. And Putin responded by refusing to cooperate with sanctions against Iran and by testing a new and sophisticated missile. Part of the problem, I think, is like Bush, Obama was absolutely convinced of his ability to charm people. And Putin seemed to be amazingly oblivious to Obama's charm. In Seoul, in a meeting in Seoul, South Korea in March of 2012, Obama famously, on a hot mic, told Dmitry Medvedev of Russia that he said, on all these issues, but particularly on missile defense, this can be solved, but it's important to give me space. Medvedev said, yeah, I understand. Obama said, this is my last election. After my election, I will have more flexibility. As I said, that was caught on an open mic and probably gave him less flexibility. But in the campaign of 2012, during a debate between the candidates, Romney said that Russia was, quote, without question, our #1 geopolitical foe. Obama mocked him and quipped that the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back. And Obama condescendingly explained that the Cold War has been over for 20 years now. Obama easily won re-election. But in June of 2013, Edward Snowden wound up in a transit lounge in an airport in Moscow, and after weeks of negotiation, on August 1st, Russia granted him temporary asylum. Obama responded by canceling a meeting with Putin after the Group of 20 meeting that was scheduled in St. Petersburg. The two, Obama and Putin, obviously did not get along, and I think this came to a head in a way with the famous red line over Syria. The line turned out to be not so red, turned out not even to be much of a line. In September 2013, a CBS reporter asked Kerry if there was anything Assad could do to prevent an attack from the United States. As Secretary of State John Kerry. Kerry said he could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Putin immediately offered to get Syria to turn over its chemical weapons if the United States would reject the use of force. Assad subsequently dragged his feet and then used chlorine gas, which was not covered by the agreement. In June of 2014, Assad turned over his list of declared chemical weapons. John Kerry and Susan Rice declared that Syria had turned over 100% of its chemical weapons. We've seen in recent weeks how well that turned out. Assad obviously has used sarin gas on his own people, and just in the last 24 hours, Israeli intelligence has released an estimate that Syria has 10 tons of chemical weapons. And then, of course, in February 2014, at the end of February or the beginning of March, Russia invaded the Ukraine. Obama regarded this as a Cold War construct, sort of something that was so yesterday. But as Rob's pointed out, there are a variety of reasons why Putin did not regard it that way. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the Obama administration said that this was not, quote, an invasion, but an uncontested arrival. And yeah, euphemism actually doesn't really alter reality, does it? But soon after the invasion, Obama declared that Russia was, quote, on the wrong side of history. setting aside whether we actually know which direction history is moving and who's on the wrong side of it. The fact is, Russia was in effective control of the Crimea, which it later annexed. Russia faced sanctions, expulsion from the G8, but in reality, Russia is the world's 8th largest economy. It's not quite so easy to isolate Russia or its economy. And I think the Obama administration found itself in the same awkward position with respect to Russia that it found itself earlier with Syria, especially when Russia annexed the Crimea in March of 2014. That month, Obama said, Russia is a regional power that's threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness. And I think that represents a certain misunderstanding. He might have done better to listen to Rob for a while and rethink that position. Russia, of course, then moved into eastern Ukraine. Obama repeatedly said this isn't a new Cold War, and to an extent he was right. But the situation wasn't all that unfamiliar either. And I think Obama came to the conclusion that he was not likely to have constructive relations with Putin from this point on. The Baltic states in particular, Rob mentioned Estonia, but I think all of the Baltic states, Latvia and Lithuania as well, worry a lot about Putin's next move. But I think the most serious concern, or strategic concern for America, is what would happen if Putin moved against a NATO country. What would the United States do? What would NATO do? If it failed to respond to such aggression, that would essentially vitiate Article 5 of the NATO treaty. An attack on one is an attack on all. By 2015, Obama's own choice for the Joint Chiefs of Staff declared that, quote, Russia represents the greatest threat to our national security. Ray Odierno, the outgoing Army Chief of Staff, called Russia America's, quote, most dangerous military threat. And Obama's own Secretary of Defense said Russia poses an existential threat to the United States. And then finally, there was Syria. In 2015, Russia built an air base at the Latakia province, a complement to its long-standing naval base at Tartus, which Rob mentioned. And the Obama administration was caught somewhat off guard by that, although I'm not sure why. In September, at the end of September 2015, a Russian general walked into the United States Embassy in Baghdad and announced that Russian jets would begin airstrikes in Syria and warned the United States to stay out of the way. Russia said that it would target ISIS, and John Kerry said, we're prepared to welcome these efforts. Well, obviously, Russian forces did not limit their attacks to ISIS or even focus on ISIS. They focused on opponents of the Assad regime. Obama said that Russia was doomed to fail in Syria, but I think he missed the point. Russia didn't intend to have Assad rule what was once Syria. All they really cared about was to consolidate Assad's hold on the Alawite areas that include Latakia and Tartus. When Putin announced in March of 2016 that he was withdrawing Russian troops from Syria, which he didn't actually do, he said the intervention had achieved its objective, and I think he was basically right. That's exactly what they did. He wanted the territory in the north and the west and in Assad's hands so it would be available to Russia, and it was. As a candidate, Donald Trump expressed optimism that he would get along with Putin. And the emphasis, once again, was on a personal relationship. It didn't even take a few weeks for that relationship to chill. Russia's support of Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons seems to have put that personal relationship in a very, very bad place. What's more, as Rob mentioned briefly, U.S. intelligence agencies agreed that Russia was behind the hacking of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, during the campaign. And I think Rob is right, that Putin's intent was less to aid Trump than simply to destabilize U.S. democracy and democracy in general. I do find it somewhat amusing that people who could never get exercised about the Soviet Union and who subsequently minimized Russian aggression, who mocked Romney for saying that Russia was the main geopolitical foe, are now nearly hysterical because Russia hacked the DNC. apparently we can look past the Gulag, slaughtering tens of millions of people and invading the Crimea, but revealing that the DNC put its thumb on the scale during the primaries for Hillary Clinton, now there they've gone too far. That's lots worse than the Gulag. And I don't mean to minimize Russian hacking or its interference in American elections. This is serious business, and it's potentially dangerous. But as the U.S. shapes its response to that, I think it's important to keep in mind context as the American administration looks for an effective response. I think it's important to move past the last administration's repeatedly stated false dichotomy between doing nothing and war. There's a whole range of options somewhere in the middle there. And Rob's presentation, I think, very clearly articulated Russian concern about expanding NATO closer to Russia. And in the aftermath of the most recent disagreements, points of conflict with Russia, we have the admission of Montenegro into NATO. Now, Montenegro is not exactly the largest or most powerful nation in the region. But normally, at this point, I would turn things over to questions from the audience, but I'm going to steal a prerogative of a first question and ask Rob whether he thinks the admission of Montenegro to NATO is a move toward a measured response, or whether it constitutes yet another provocation from a Russian perspective. And with that, I'll leave it to Rob.
How this works. Does that work? All right, fantastic. Yeah, I don't know is the answer. No, I think it's probably, I mean, it's a good question. And I think, I mean, I would imagine that from the Russian perspective, the admission of Montenegro, one of the former constituent elements of Yugoslavia, has to be seen, I'm sure, as yet another act of provocation, another domino to fall as NATO continues to expand. I don't think that most Western audiences appreciate how the Eastern March of NATO is understood, not only by Russian policymakers, but by ordinary Russians too. And, you know, this sort of fear of the West that I was referring to with regards to Putinism, I think that, you know, that informs policy in the Kremlin, that informs foreign. I don't think that, you know, is indicative of any sort of anti-American scare among the Russian people as a whole. I don't mean to suggest that, or any sort of broad tidal wave of anti-Americanism. But, you know, if Russia or China or any one of a small handful of, you know, major nuclear powers were to enter into a defensive military alliance where an attack on one was considered an attack on all, to enter into an alliance like that with Panama, for instance, might raise some eyebrows in the United States. And I think if we maybe flip it around and see how this could be conceived of by Russians as a threatening move.
Thanks. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
I'd like to ask Professor Green a real broad question, if you can answer this. You stated that the U.S. has broken virtually every promise we've made to the Russians since 1990. And I'm wondering if the United States had played its role differently, either been more accommodating or less aggressive as viewed by the Russians, could all this have changed? Could this progression have been reversed? Or is this just sort of the inevitable way opposing superpowers act toward each other?
And that's an excellent question. I don't think that there was anything preordained or inevitable about the course of U.S.-Russian relations since the collapse of the USSR, but decisions made on both sides seem to have, you know, as they often do, sort of conspired to make these events seem to have gone down a particularly sort of inexorable, ineluctable path. I think that the efforts of American policymakers and non-state actors to make sure that Russia after 1991 developed along a normal democratic free market path, as we know, led to chaos. The decision to not only maintain NATO with the absence now, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, but to expand NATO, you know, in retrospect, seems to have been an unnecessarily or needlessly kind of antagonistic move on the part of the Western powers. Now, it's easy to say, dismantling NATO, and I mean, that's far easier said than done. I mean, there are enormous, not only military, but deep financial and economic considerations or implications of such a policy. And for any one of a number of reasons that go far beyond my analytical abilities, we didn't see that. Instead, we saw quite the opposite. But so I think it's possible, certainly, to imagine other paths down which those relations might have gone. And maybe Mike wants to say a word about that.
I think I'd just add one thing, and that is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States policymakers understood that American aid would be very helpful, but Reagan left Bush with an empty budget, with a huge deficit, and there simply wasn't the kind of money to initiate a Marshall Plan, not without huge tax increases that wouldn't have been popular and would have violated Bush's own pledge, to help the Soviet Union begin to reconstruct itself along the lines that Rob described. So there's one option that might have gone that, but that was simply hamstrung by the practicality of not having the resources to do it.
Michel.
Yes, can you dwell a bit on that period? I think it's crucial. Like when the Soviet Union collapsed, remember when Milton Friedman, I mean, there was total disarray in Soviet Union, and the same thing didn't happen in China. Milton Friedman sent his Chicago boys, and Goldman Sachs, I think, tell me if I'm right, at the beginning, and they more or less imposed, seduced, coaxed a system within 2 or 3 years of pure liberalism, neoliberalism on the Russian economy. And imagine how does that feel? I mean, it's a violation, it's an aggression, and this has not been digested by Russia. And we have the reaction. Putinism has this trauma. He carries this Russian trauma in the mind. I mean, it's...
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's been a lot of sort of hand-wringing and consternation in the Western media for the past 25 years. Why don't the Russians like democracy? I think that democracy for many Russians conjures up the exact kind of chaos that you're talking about, Michel. And that democracy and the connotations of democracy were absolutely associated with the sort of shock therapy of market capitalism in the 1990s, which was made even worse by the emergence of the oligarchy in the 1990s, when privately or when previously state-held monopolies were sold off to the lowest bidder, Yeltsin's cronies, and so capitalism and democracy are not held up in Russia today as many Westerners can't imagine. Why not? Well, sometimes it's held up as the answer is sometimes put forward that, well, it's because there's just not any sort of deep tradition of this in the Russian past. But I think the deep tradition is the traumatic memory of the 1990s. There was a poll taken, thousands of polls were taken in the 1990s when all of a sudden you could really take polls and gain some insight into popular opinion. But a poll was taken in the 1990s. What's more important to you, Russian citizens were asked, a strong leader or a democratic leader? And in 1992, it was 70% of Russians saying a democratic leader. 20% said they wanted a strong leader. 10% didn't understand the question. And then when the question was posed again in 2002, 10 years later, it was exactly the opposite. 70% said they wanted a strong leader. 20% said they wanted a democratic leader. And still 10% didn't understand the question. But a complete reversal because of the trauma, I think, is the way to conceptualize it, to categorize it. You're absolutely right.
Although the one thing I'd add to that is an analogy that isn't exact, but Spain, when Franco died, there was a socialist government that came in, and They actually paid people wages, and that's why they paid people wages under Franco. They're just very, very low. They were set low, and nobody dared to protest. And inflation ran away, and people's savings were eaten up, especially old people. And just as you saw people mourning the days of Stalin, you saw people in Spain mourning the days of Franco. And as someone who played tennis there and didn't live there, but saw that, I mean, Franco was fascism with a human face, but he was a fascist. And to think that they wanted to go back to that gives you the shock of that. Really did create kind of a backlash. But again, Spain didn't go in that direction, and I think there are a whole variety of different reasons for the departure. But even with that chaos, I suppose there's still room for a potential of a different outcome. Every historical case is a unique combination of the events and an underlying background of the particular country and the way things went in the aftermath. Spain, of course, wasn't a major power either, didn't have a nuclear arsenal and all the rest. Any other, yeah.
What is your read on the recent demonstrations in Russia now? Is that against Putin? And if they're not for democracy and capitalism, what is the basis of this movement?
It's a good question. I think I'd refer you to a recent book that was published by Anne Garrels. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. It's called Putin Country. She's an NPR correspondent, or was for many years an NPR correspondent. And for each of the last, I think, 12 or 15 years, she's gone back to the Siberian city of Chelyabinsk. 500,000 people live in this industrial town, part of what used to be the Gulag Archipelago, and during World War II, a major industrial center for the production of military hardware and tanks. And since 1991, just a sort of collapsing hellscape. And Anne Garrels' book is a series of conversations with ordinary Russians, many of whom are engaged in questions of legal reform. Many of them are engaged in questions of rebuilding a shattered infrastructure. And one of the things that struck me reading this book is, well, two things. One, that there seems to be no predictable way in which the political views and opinions of Russians can easily be pinpointed. Support for the military action in eastern Ukraine, for instance, cuts across demographic lines, it cuts across socioeconomic lines, levels of education, almost every reliable metric to determine the likelihood of an individual espousing a particular political position is out the window here. So my point is that there are individuals across Russia today who support one or more elements of this kind of, ingredient list of Putinism, who subscribe to the cult of personality but don't like the foreign policy, or who like the respect for religious faith but aren't so fond of the economic cronyism, or so forth and so on. I mean, there's a whole slate of aspects of Putinism from which individuals draw. So I think it's very difficult to say what exactly the average Russian would prefer to Putinism. Because for the average Russian, the period since 2000 has witnessed an increase in real income levels. And so the Putin period is associated by many with economic recovery. After the disastrous collapse of the ruble in '98, in the last years of the Yeltsin regime, Putin presided over an economic stabilization. I think, and he won the war in Chechnya brutally, right? But he can claim to have won it. These two signal victories, accompanied by this sort of, hard line on terror, have helped people come to see Putinism as a sort of new normal. And they've exchanged a kind of desire for the democratic process. Well, at least we have security and stability and a few flat screen TVs. This is more important right now. When you do see, and this is the second point that also ties with Garrels' book, when you do see on TV, on the rare occasions when you do see informed media coverage of Russian events on TV or on the radio, and you see protesters, they are in one of two places. They are either in Moscow or they are in St. Petersburg, and more likely they're in Moscow. They're not in Chelyabinsk. They're not in Nizhny Novgorod. They're not in the provincial cities. So what we see, these real public manifestations of political discontent against Putinism are very, I think, limited in number and restricted largely to the political capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is not to say, as the Kremlin is fond of saying, that 90% of the country supports everything we do. It's that thwarted by the possibility of effecting any real and meaningful change, most Russians elect to stay home. The Kremlin then spins that indifference as support, and I'm not sure that it necessarily is. If that answers your question, I hope. Thanks.
Anybody else? Oh, wait, we've got somebody over there. Would you please go to the mic?
This question might be sort of abstract, but I was just wondering if, with your knowledge of the history of Russia and its leaders, of what do you think that leaders around the world can learn from Vladimir Putin? I mean, a lot of people see him as this anti-globalist figure who's kind of like, fighting globalism on his own. And what do you think people can learn from him to help maybe politicians become more popular?
Well, you could take over the media, control the message. That would help. No, but it's interesting. I mean, a serious response, I guess, would be that it's interesting to note how Putin has become a kind of darling figure among a certain fringe of the American extreme political right. The sort of Alex Jones type have come to embrace Putin. And I'm sure there's all sorts of intriguing but disturbing reasons behind that. A kind of latent desire for authoritarianism, I think, would be a chief reason. As far as lessons go, I'm drawing a blank here as to any kind of real sort of constructive lessons that might be learned. But I think maybe a cautionary tale might be careful of over-investing in extractive industries at the expense of other avenues of economic diversification. The Russian economy is very much hinged to global oil and gas prices. And if those oil and gas prices fluctuate dramatically and the Russian economy crumbles, Putin's popularity, I think, will collapse as a result. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're getting at in terms of sort of lessons, but yeah, thanks. Mike?
You had something. Would you please go to the mic so the camera can pick it up? Sorry about that.
This somewhat follows from the earlier question in your response, but the Western media and certainly our government pretty consistently describes Vladimir Putin as, from a personal standpoint, as a murderous thug. He's corrupt, he assassinates his political and economic rivals, he's despotic by nature. I'm always interested in trying to see how much of that is a spin or how much of that is strictly accurate. Apparently a sizable number of his countrymen think he is a strong but effective leader, somebody who's responding to the West the way a response needs to be generated. I'm wondering, based on whatever the true facts may be in your understanding of those, is he basically a bad guy, in addition to being a very increasingly effective opposition leader?
I think yes. But what does that mean to say? I think if you look at what happened a few years ago, for example, to Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oligarch, the unwritten but very much spoken arrangement between Putin and the oligarchs goes back to the Yeltsin years. Make as much money as you want. Plunder the nation's resources as much as you like, but do not interfere with the existing political system. When Khodorkovsky crossed that line and violated that tacit agreement, that's when Putin used the state to crush him, to destroy him. Similarly with Berezovsky as well. So, and you look at Navalny and others. I mean, there's no shortage of political wreckage, individuals that Putinism has left in its wake. So I think you are talking about a guy who deals ruthlessly with political opposition. And I think oftentimes that's sort of referred to as, well, he's a KGB guy, that's what they do. He wasn't, it wasn't a sort of James Bond. I mean, he was pushing papers in Dresden. He was a company man, and he was following orders and an eminent functionary. And that's what he was. I mean, it wasn't the sort of cloak and dagger past is something that I think has been exaggerated greatly in recent years. Putinism does not brook or tolerate diversity of opinion, diversity of expression, things that are central to the American or the sort of Western political culture, political process. And so I think the word I always use to describe Putin or Putinism is illiberal, in the sense that it does not see the relationship between the state and society as one in which the state serves to protect and safeguard the rights of the individual. In the Putinist model, the state keeps society in line. The state serves a kind of regulatory purpose. The state does not exist for the, sort of classic 19th century liberal idea of guaranteeing unpopular speech. Unpopular speech is silenced in Russia, and there's a whole host of journalists and public figures who have paid the ultimate price for challenging those thick lines that Putin has laid out. So, I think he's a very troubling figure. I don't think he's a model for any political figure in this country to emulate, to be sure. Mike, maybe you have something to add to that.
Any other questions? We've got, yeah.
You've spoken about Putinism. One thing I haven't heard too much about is the people. And to me, there's the left hand and the right hand. So you have a strong right hand, but I'm curious what you can share with us about the people of Russia. I've heard stories where private ownership doesn't exist. The addiction of alcohol and drugs is quite high. There's an unhappiness level for the people of Russia I've heard about. So if you could possibly share what you know about that, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I think, to answer your question, I mean, what happened in the 1990s, and this gets back to Michel's point earlier, not only did the Soviet Union collapse, but you had the complete collapse of the entire social fabric and social networks, institutions of social support, education, health, healthcare, family networks. I mean, as employment opportunities decreased, as mines shut down, as factories were shuttered, you had a complete breakdown of the social order. And I think that affected families and neighborhoods and individuals in profound ways. And there's all sorts of demographic data, to get to your question, about life expectancy, which in the 1990s was appallingly low, particularly among Russian men. And rates of alcohol abuse contributed significantly to that. Also, the complete, again, collapse of a social safety net, as hospitals and clinics were unable to continue providing care for patients in the manner that they had struggled to do before the collapse. They completely could not do this. And things have stabilized again in the 2000s. There's some indications that suggest the demographic crisis, which was such a concern to Russian political figures and intellectuals in the 1990s, has evened itself out. It's difficult to say with any certainty what the people, as a whole think, but I think there's a great deal more optimism among ordinary Russians today than there was, in 1997, certainly, going back 20 years. I think there's a sense that the basic quality of life, standard of living has improved dramatically in 20 years. And I think that's translated into a general, if not optimism, at least perhaps a slightly sunnier take. Thanks.
We have time for about one more question, if there is one. Going once, going twice. In that case, thank you all for coming, and thank Rob. I think he delivered on the promise.